So I'm just going to go ahead and give a brief overview of the bios of Felicia and Allison. Felicia Kornblue is a professor of history with a secondary appointment in gender, sexuality, and women's studies, and an affiliated faculty member in Jewish studies at the University of Vermont. Allison Pugh is professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at the University of Virginia. So Allison, I'll turn the discussion over to you to get started.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kinshasa. And thanks to the association for the opportunity to take part in this conversation. When I said yes to this event, I had not read the book yet. And when I sat down to read it, I was prepared. I kind of steeled myself for a long and detailed dive into the history of abortion rights. But Felicia starts her preface the day after her mother had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, which was the very same day that she learned that her mother had actually played a role in changing New York abortion law. And this is how she wrote about that. She said, "By early Saturday morning, my mother was on life support, her brain mostly washed away like a cheap but utterly irreplaceable hard drive." And at that moment, I knew we were in good hands. And I felt like we were in the hands of a powerful writer who would accompany us on this journey. And I should have known at the outset, because Felicia has always known how to write. What this audience might not know about you, Felicia, is that while you were at Hunter, you were a reporter for Children's Express, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 1982, with articles reported from Cambodia, Japan, and Russia. So there's some beautiful language in this book and a real knowledge of the writerly craft. And there is also wisdom. So here's one of my favorite sentences. She said, "With the narcissism of a child toward her parents, the sense that their stories end when we show up, I barely asked about later parts of her story." And I was just like, oh, that was really so well observed. And then what might be fun for this group is that it is full of very local New York City politics and humor. So, for instance, she writes, "This was a neighborhood in which winning a Democratic primary was as good as being elected, since it was home to fewer Republican voters than bodegas that sold Caribbean-style café con leche, or bakeries that offered Hamantaschen, the pastry associated with the Jewish holiday Purim, year-round." So these aspects make the book a real pleasure to read, and it is an honor to be here. And I have a slew of questions for you, and I know our audience will have their own. So I'll get started. So the first question is, the thing that makes the book unique as a history is the way it chronicles not just the fight for abortion rights before Roe v. Wade, but also the fight against sterilization abuse, or the prevalence of involuntary sterilization that happened more often to non-consenting women of color, sometimes when they were looking for an abortion. In fact, so common among Black women that it is sometimes called the Mississippi appendectomy, as Felicia points out. So, and by extraordinary coincidence, across the hall from Felicia and her mother in 8B was the woman in 8A, a Puerto Rican woman and head of pediatrics named Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias, who was a leader in the movement against sterilization abuse. And I wonder, Felicia, if you can walk us through your decision to feature both of these movements and how you discovered Rodriguez Trias's role. So I want both the substantive answer about why the two stories need to be told, and also the writer's answer about when and how you stumbled upon this hook for the way you tell them.
That is a great question. And I'm just going to back up for a second and say, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I've been in educational institutions my whole career, and I learned a lot in a lot of them, but I learned more at Hunter than anywhere else. And I still think that Hunter alums are the smartest people on the planet. So yay us. And thank you. And thank you, Allison, for the super generous introduction. I have to say, part of my answer is that I don't know. There's something a little bit magical about me having remembered at a certain point when I was putting the book together and starting to conceptualize it as not just an academic book, but a trade book, a book that could reach a general interest audience. That at a certain point, I just knew that Helen had to be the other figure in the book. And I don't know where that came from, but I do know I've been teaching on these issues for a long time as a historian, but also as somebody who teaches interdisciplinary gender studies classes. And, and those classes tend to be more openly political and engaged with contemporary debates. And especially, since we're when we're in a gender studies context, we can talk about debates within the movement. Right, and instead of it being posed as "quote unquote" pro-life versus "quote unquote" pro-choice, we kind of have the luxury of assuming that everybody in the room has some kind of understanding of women, gender, sexuality, and we can talk in a more intense way about debates and conflicts, especially over race and class, that have dogged the history of American feminism. And continue to dog the history of American feminism. And particularly, I've been talking to students for the last 20 plus years about the challenge that the contemporary movement for reproductive justice, as people call it, as activists and scholars call it, the challenge that has posed to the mainstream reproductive rights movement and to organizations like Planned Parenthood. And there's been an ongoing tension, I think, between people who are more attentive to issues of race and class, and who really want those to be at the heart of the reproductive rights agenda, versus people who've more been in a stance of like, we have to save abortion, well, we don't have time to think about that. All we can do is save abortion, or all we can do is fight for abortion rights. And that tension is something that I've been really interested in. And really have been inviting students to sort of challenge themselves around, look at their own assumptions, and who do they include, who do they not include, what issues make it into the reproductive rights agenda the way they understand it, and what issues don't make it, and how do they make those choices, right? So I think a lot of it came from there, from kind of years of being in that inquiry with students. And so even though I really wanted to write about my mom and sort of through the door of my mother's experience to look at what happened in New York in the fight for legal abortion and how that affected Roe versus Wade, right? I knew that I didn't just want it to be an abortion story, because I knew that there were other aspects of that story, right? Because I've been having that conversation over the last 2 decades plus. And it turns out that this woman who was our next door neighbor, Dr. Rodriguez Trias, she was a critically important person in terms of launching what today we would call a reproductive justice movement or reproductive justice analysis. So I was lucky in that way.
Incredible. I mean, amazing kind of frame on which to hinge all these different ideas. So your answer is making me skip ahead to question number 5. We'll go back to question 2 later, but question 5 is, I was shocked to read, and this is probably because I was an innocent here, shocked to read that in the early fights against sterilization abuse, NOW and Planned Parenthood were opposed. Like they were literally the enemy, according to the anti-abuse activists. And I have to say, I am appalled by that history, but also kind of mystified. So the argument that anti-sterilization abuse activists are making, that reproductive freedom means women can decide when and if they want to be parents, seems really obvious to me. So can you explain why those groups were opposed? And then I think they are now on board regarding the issue. And is there a story about how and why that happened? And then the third question is, you yourself are active in Planned Parenthood. How have you reconciled yourself to their role in this history?
Yeah, I'm gonna hold off on the last one for a minute. it is a really amazing history. So Helen, the late Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias, who was my neighbor, she and a pretty small group of other people, they form a group called the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse, or CESA in Spanish. And they win a series of victories at controlling sterilization abuse, first in the New York City public hospital system, and then via city council legislation in all healthcare settings in the city of New York. And then ultimately with some other allies, they go to the federal level and they get the Federal Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to issue new sterilization guidelines that they think will control sterilization abuse. And at every stage, their chief antagonist is Planned Parenthood. Yeah. And in New York City, the New York City chapter of NOW changes its position and actually winds up being an ally. Before they get to the city council, New York NOW is an ally. But National NOW continues to be on the other side all the way through. And the part of the way I understand it is that Planned Parenthood and NOW are worried about any controls on people's reproductive choice or liberty, and they think that if the government tries to control sterilization abuse, they're just going to wind up interfering with people's choices, and that might wind up setting kind of a precedent for controls on abortion. And from our perspective today, there's a little bit of evidence for that. I mean, like there are waiting periods in all these states before people can seek an abortion. The waiting period idea may have started with the anti-sterilization movement. They wanted to impose a waiting period before somebody could have a sterilization surgery because they were afraid that people were being pushed into it against their will. But I think the other thing is that there were real issues of race and class in those organizations, and there still are to a certain degree. And when women of color, like Helen, who was Puerto Rican, and other Puerto Rican independentists that she was working with, when they came forward and they said, look, this is a crisis on the island of Puerto Rico, it's becoming a crisis on the US mainland, we see it in New York, we see it in the public hospitals, it's a crisis in the Deep South for Black women, right? When they came forward and said that, the white women in Planned Parenthood and NOW just kind of didn't get it. Like, it wasn't their issue. They were more worried about people not being able to access sterilization when they wanted to, because that was the white woman's story. So it couldn't be a more classic issue of what we now call intersectionality, right? That you have to understand that people operate very specific social locations, and their experience of everything, even their experience of being pregnant or their experience of having a doctor and their relationship with that doctor is totally shaped, not just by their sex or their gender, but also by their racial background and how they're perceived and their class background and all that stuff. And so for somebody like my mom, I don't exactly know what she thought about the sterilization issue. I don't have any evidence about that. But she just didn't understand that part of the story. It wasn't her experience. It wasn't the experience of the people she loved or the people around her. She wasn't in a mixed race or mixed class community. And I think that was a lot of it. That was, it was people not being able to see past their own experience. And there were some white folks, I mean, to give them some credit, there were white reproductive rights activists who worked with Helen and others on this issue. But for the most part, no, they didn't, because it wasn't their issue. And about today, I'll just say quickly.
I'm open to, if you don't want to answer that, that's fine. I just.
No. I'm the former board chair, and now I'm the vice president of the board of Planned Parenthood of Vermont Action Fund. And we do the advocacy work at the state level. And I also was on the board of our regional Planned Parenthood, which supports all the clinics. And we've gone through very difficult conversations in Planned Parenthood about our history and the legacy of people like Margaret Sanger early in the 20th century, who, later in her career, at least worked with, if she wasn't herself a eugenicist. We've talked a lot about that stuff, and we've talked a lot about the reproductive justice challenge to the movement. And those were the conversations that were happening inside the board when I was on the Planned Parenthood of Northern New England board. You know, so I think the work comes from that as well. It comes from a real effort and a commitment on my part to participating in the movement and, you know, supporting abortion rights, and at the same time trying to hold the movement to a high standard.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that. Okay, so shifting slightly, the book features some nuggets that do a fabulous job of transporting us all back to that time. And I'm going to give you some examples. For example, a woman's age multiplied by the number of women she had born had to total 120 or more before they would accede to her sterilization request. You have a great paragraph about Alex Cates Schulman, the radical feminist, who says to her husband, "I'm going across the park to this abortion speak out." And he didn't want her to go, but she left the house anyway. Quote, "An act of defiance. You can't even imagine that one would have to be defiant to one's husband in order to do anything. I'm sure you can't imagine it, but that's the way it was then." And I imagine that was a quote she gave you in an interview. And then your mother's letter accompanying the work she had done to draft the law was signed Mrs. David Beatrice Kornblue. And I was just like, Mrs. David, you know, so these kind of details convey something about what it was like to live back then. But you also describe people who can see past this, see past their own shackles, who like refuse to accept things as they were, whose capacity to imagine freedom and equality is really quite remarkable, given just how subordinated women were. So just one example, there's like a protest at a committee meeting kind of, and a state senator upbraided the demonstrators. "What have you accomplished? There are people here who want to do something for you." And the response, "We're tired of being done for. We want to do for a change." So I have a substantive question and a writerly question. First, how do you think these people managed to see beyond the constraints of the time? And also, how do you as a historian kind of transport yourself back to that cultural moment? How do you make sure you are conveying what felt possible? So this is more than just being accurate about who did what. It's about kind of ascertaining like a zeitgeist. And it's not just seeing the past with the eyes of what's possible in the present. And that seems particularly tricky. So I'm just really interested in how you do both.
Yeah, I love those nuggets you pulled out. I actually was just talking to my students about the fact that my mother signs that letter, Mrs. David Kornblue, even though she's calling for a repeal of all abortion restrictions for the first time, possibly in the modern West. It is amazing. Well, I think I got a big assist on this from my scholarly colleagues. So when I start really telling the kind of the narrative of the story starting in New York in the early 60s, I'm very aware of the role of the National Organization for Women as a women's civil rights group. My mother was a member of NOW. It was as a member of the NOW Abortion Committee that my mother got involved in this issue. NOW kind of generated a separate advocacy organization. It spun off, but it was from New York NOW ultimately that the big push for the decriminalization of abortion happened in New York State, and there's been really great work done on the origins of NOW and how it came from women who were in the federal government, as my mom was, and women who were in the trade unions. And my mom was a labor lawyer. She worked for the National Labor Relations Board and had worked for unions. So it made a lot of sense. She was, very much of that milieu. And I think it gets easier to see, if we can imagine stair steps instead of imagining quantum leaps, into something like feminist consciousness. So, there were women working within the trade unions and they were developing a certain agenda, and there were women working in the federal government and they developed networks with each other, talking about some of the things that they were dissatisfied by and some of the blocks to their career advancement. And they, they got together and they pushed the federal government. And then there was a President's Commission on the Status of Women under JFK that they created through their dissatisfaction. But then once it produced its report, that became another opportunity to grow, so it's sort of like there's a very small circle of people within very particular institutions, and then it gets wider and wider and wider. And then once you have a National Organization for Women in '66, which is the result of all those prior things, then you have a foundation for talking about women's civil rights, and you have a language, a vocabulary, right? You have an agenda. And within about 1 year, they add abortion and the demand for full repeal of abortion restrictions to their agenda as part of what they understand as foundational women's civil rights. And then there are people who get even more radical. They decide that now is too moderate and too legalistic and so on. But I think you need to have that first. You need to have a foundation and a vocabulary, and somebody needs to name the issue of women's civil rights and to say for the first time, hey, this is structural. It's structural, it's systemic, it's in our law codes, this sex discrimination. It's not just, whatever, you had a bad boss or something like that. And all that had to be constructed, it all had to be built. So to some degree, it was built over a longer period of time, but then particularly in the early to mid 60s, it was built. And then I think it's easier to understand how, Alex Cates Shulman, who comes in a little bit later and joins the women's liberation movement, which is a more radical branch, comes to talk to other women and to kind of develop the spine where she can say to her husband, I don't care what you want, I'm going to go to the demonstration. And, look at that, she survived to tell the tale. And so then she was powerful enough to do it again a second time. So I think that's the way I come to understand it, more as a series of steps than as a big departure. And as a writer, I don't know. I mean, I love natural language. I love the way people talk. And I talk to a lot of people for this book. I think in part I benefited from the fact that under COVID conditions, I couldn't really go to a lot of traditional archives. So I had to rely on interviews, and I found everybody I could find, and I talked to them in a big group at one time, and I talked to a lot of people one-on-one. And I just love those moments where people get kind of emphatic and dramatic, like Alex Cates Shulman saying to me, in this personal way, you can't imagine what this was like. I mean, of course I can't imagine. But yeah, I'm drawn to those moments where people kind of step out of quotidian speech and they say something that has heat to it.
Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so starting with the abortion rights side of the book, there are some great stats and stories that tell us about its impact once the law passed. So the law passes, and all of a sudden, the rate of infant mortality in New York City falls from 24.4 to 20.7, likely because people in the first or second trimester of risky pregnancies were able to terminate those pregnancies. And by the way, that number is 3.9 today, which is really kind of amazing. And New York City is actually much lower than the national number. But anyway, also the number admitted to city hospitals with incomplete or incompetently performed procedures dropped by half in 1970 alone. And at a time when childbearing outside of marriage was profoundly stigmatized, this is all Felicia's language, and could wreck educational or vocational aspirations, out of wedlock births declined after 15 years of increase. It declined in 1971. And so what made the law stand out, why it mattered, was apparently its lack of a residency requirement, so that women all over the world could come to New York if they could afford to travel. And then Felicia tells us one woman refused to take the referral because she said she didn't need no telephone number in New York. She didn't know nobody in New York. She didn't have any way to get to New York. She didn't have no money for New York and all. And that woman died from a self-induced abortion. So I'm highlighting all these stats and stories of the aftermath because I want to hear from you whether this is kind of the flip side of what we will see again in a post-Dobbs world. And so I want to hear you talk about how does your book about the world before Roe versus Wade tell us about what is coming to us in the world after Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, thanks. There may be people who are on tonight who remember before New York State changed its law, or who remember the impact once it was changed. And I'd love to hear from you, or if you want to put something in the chat. I was balancing this thing where I wanted to acknowledge how much of a game changer the change in the law in New York was, and how it may have set us on the road to Roe versus Wade. And I'm kind of rooting for my mom as being involved in this thing that was historically important, and at the same time to acknowledge the limits, right? And I just became more and more aware of the limits as we got closer and closer to the Dobbs opinion from the Supreme Court. Once New York was open for business, and what happened in New York is, right, the new statute that was passed in 1970 said that you can basically make your own choice through 24 weeks of a pregnancy, right? And so it was only going to be regulated after that. So that's roughly Justice Blackmun's first 2 trimesters, right? And no residence requirement. So it was a huge deal, but only for people who could get to New York. And so I think it's what happened there was a great reminder of the fact that, having some states where abortion is still, safe and legal and relatively affordable, like, that's really important, and it's completely inadequate. And no matter how much we talk today about, abortion funds are going to help people get across state lines. And people in blue states like mine, are trying to open their homes when people need to come and they need lodging and so on. There are a lot of people who are not going to be able to come. And it's not strictly about finances for some people, but there are other kinds of barriers too. Psychological barriers. People don't think that they can travel. They don't know anybody. It's it's terrifying. People have other children and other family members they're committed to. There's a lot of other stuff. So to me, it wound up being a story about the limitations of a state-by-state approach, and a real refutation of what some of the Supreme Court justices were saying about how, we could just return it to the people, and and allow states to do their own thing, and then people will sort it out. That's not the way things are right now, and it's not the way it's going to be. It introduces this incredible kind of unfairness on the basis of race and class and geography, and I don't know why that's not unconstitutional. Frankly, I'm no Supreme Court justice, but it seems pretty bad to me.
I'm no Supreme Court justice, but so there are some amazing people whom we meet in your book. There are some characters that I think stand as profiles in courage. I will give you some examples. So Florence Kennedy is an incredible person. So here she is commenting. You say she graduated Columbia Law in 1951, already disillusioned with conventional legal ways of thinking. And there's a parentheses. They want an almost mathematical mind, the kind of person who can walk past a pool of blood and think, what a beautiful shade of red. And that just floored me, that quote, because I feel like I know people like that now. Like, that's a conventional way of thinking that's not limited only to legal circles. Then George Michaels, a Jewish Democrat from a heavily Catholic district in central New York. Without 2 final votes, the bill would fail. And he's an assemblyman, and he stands up and he says, I realize, Mr. Speaker, that I am terminating my political career, but I cannot in good conscience sit here and allow my vote to be the one that defeats this bill. I ask that my vote be changed from no to yes. And he's like fighting back tears, and he gets voted out. And I'm just so impressed by the courage there. And then the clergy referral service. Jewish church administrator Arlene Carmen and Baptist minister Howard Moody. And it's like this grassroots direct action. One minister called illegality a threshold for all of the participants in the service. We all did counseling all the time, but we hadn't been asked to step across a threshold. Well, we had in the civil rights movement. We'd had a lot of experience stepping across that kind of threshold there, he's saying. And so they were kind of like ready to do that. And I'm so amazed by these people. So my question for you is, some of these people have faded in history. Is there anybody that you ran across in this project whom you wish was more widely remembered?
Well, all of those people. I'm waiting for the Flo Kennedy movie. I think Florence or Flo Kennedy would be a great subject. And if anybody wants to work on that, hire me as a consultant and let's do it together. There's one biography of her written by an academic, published by an academic press. But other than that, no modern work on this astounding person. She was an attorney. She was an early member of New York Now, and one of the people who was responsible for putting abortion immediately on the agenda of the National Organization for Women. But she also did media advocacy work, and she was anti-war, and she helped organize one of the first Black Power conferences. And later, the only way anybody knows her is that later on, she used to travel the country with Gloria Steinem, and they were kind of a buddy team talking about women's rights and feminism. I guess they kind of protected each other on the road too. But I think she deserves to be known for much more than that. Like really a wonderful person and an attorney who had a very particular way of using the law, as a tool in social change. So yeah, and with the clergy folks, I think they also really deserve to be remembered, and I think that they stand as kind of a challenge to us. I belong to a liberal synagogue. I'm part of the social action committee. We're nice folks, we read books together and talk about justice. But we're not breaking the law and risking going to jail, which is what those folks were doing. And I think that it's important for us to study, that history and to ask ourselves, why were they able to do what they were able to do? First participating in the Black Civil Rights Movement, and then in the abortion rights movement, and in a bunch of other movements. Why were they able to do it? And what about us? Like, is there more we could do?
Yeah, that was fascinating and so important to read. And I had heard about the Jane service up in Chicago, but never about these people in my own hometown. Okay, so the sterilization issue has more non-white actors, and it takes place in different parts of the city. And you have this great story about the young lords using flamboyant militant action in their healthcare work to test for TB. They demanded in June 1970 that the New York Tuberculosis Association let them use its truck to survey Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. The goal was to serve people the association wasn't reaching in its middle of the weekday rounds. When the association refused, the young lords stole the truck, raised the Puerto Rican flag over it, and named it the Ramon Betances health truck after the Puerto Rican doctor who led the Grito de Lares, the 1868 rebellion against Spanish colonial rule. And the action ended with the city administration agreeing to pay for the young lords to continue operating their health truck every day of the week for 12 hours a day. That was amazing. So Lindsay, talk about what it was like to collect that history, how it was different or the same, and did you feel like you were learning new things about the New York you thought you knew, basically?
Yeah, I did. The Young Lords organization, which was a Puerto Rican rough equivalent, it was different, but it was a rough equivalent of the Black Panther Party. And in part, they come to prominence because all the leaders of the Black Panther Party in New York were in jail for like 18 months on trumped up charges. So the Young Lords are really understudied and under-discussed, although I was just at the Museum of the City of New York, and there's one little area where they do talk about them in their working class or their Protest New York exhibit. So I certainly didn't know enough about them, and even more, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party hasn't been written about at all. It was an independentist, pro-Puerto Rican independence political party on the island, but they also had branches on the US mainland calling for Puerto Rican independence, but also in the case of this New York community, and especially the women inside the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, they also were advocating for controls on sterilization abuse, because that was an urgent issue on the island and also on the mainland. I mean, one thing I learned and really thought about a lot was just in general how people who think about the US and who study the US don't think about the US empire enough. You know, we don't think about Puerto Rico enough. We don't think about the other territories enough. And we forget that, especially in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you know, the time that we think of as sort of the high point of activism and social change, like questions about Puerto Rican status and Puerto Rican independence were really big. You know, there were like huge rallies at Madison Square Garden, and you know, it was very much a part of what was going on the kind of the edges of liberalism and in the American left. But that's really, really been forgotten. So I learned a lot about that. And I thought a lot about how people's understanding, even their understanding of reproductive rights, was shaped by their location, not just their social location as sort of a metaphor, but their literal location. Even if you just look, where are people in New York City? And if you're in the South Bronx, you know, you wind up with one approach, which focuses on the fact that there's a crappy local hospital. So the difference between how you're being treated for abortion and how you're being treated for anything else are not such big differences. Like the thing that people in the South Bronx wanted was a decent hospital. And then for folks who were in Manhattan, and especially, you know, on the relatively prosperous Upper West Side of Manhattan, not as prosperous as it is now, like my mom and us, you know, we kind of had the luxury to see abortion care as more of an anomaly, you know, because our general relationship with the healthcare system was a positive one. And it was just in this one area where it seemed like we couldn't access safe, decent care, right? So I think what you pointed to is really important, and I did have to do some learning about that. I was very much of a Manhattan kid, you know. I wouldn't go someplace when I was growing up if I had to take more than one subway. Certainly not if I had to take more than two subways. So that limited my life a lot. And I think people who were living in the South Bronx of those days, people who were living in parts of Brooklyn in those days, were really having a different relationship to power and medicine, and you know, and that also meant that they wound up with a different understanding of the agenda, like of what the necessary agenda was.
So I have a whole bunch of other questions. I'll ask one more, and then maybe we can ask a couple from the audience. There's two in the chat, I think. But I could go on forever. So if people don't feel, you know, if they're feeling shy, I'm happy to keep going. But the one I want to get to now is, so there are many details and observations in the book that feel really relevant to today. For example, Constance Cook concludes while listening to the debate that the abortion law reform approach would never succeed. Its advocates didn't seem to understand that this was a political issue, not a moral issue. And that what would change its fortunes was not argument, but political power. And when I read that, I felt like it was speaking to me about today. So when you give us lessons for the future, and you do towards the end of the book, you talk about how progress doesn't depend on the Supreme Court, and how the first lesson is that there is no substitute for organizing. So I want to hear from you where you think the most promising sites of organizing is happening today that you know of. Where is the most exciting political action on the ground happening today?
Well, thanks for that. And I will just put in one little plug. So Assemblywoman Constance Cook, who played a big role in this, she was a feminist Republican. And one of the things that this story reveals is that the Republican Party was a very different entity, especially in New York, than it is now, and especially on these issues. And it just, it's one of those historical things that by seeing that things were different in the past, we can imagine that maybe they could be different in the future, and that they don't have to be the way they are. So just to say that. And in terms of today, I'm most excited about contemporary reproductive justice, organizing, and politics. And that's being done by a lot of different people. Like I was just reading this long article in The Guardian about the West Alabama Women's Health Center. I may not be getting the title exactly right, but it's the last abortion clinic in the state of Alabama. And its medical director is somebody who's been hounded by the state, and they took her license to practice away for almost a year, and so on. And what excites me about the work that they're doing, and other on the ground, often women of color run organizations in red states in particular, is that they understand that the fight isn't just about abortion, that it's also about, for example, the crisis over maternal mortality, which is a national crisis in the United States. And we've seen that, post-COVID, the numbers have been going up. It's especially a crisis for women of color. Right, so they understand that these issues are all connected, that we can't talk about abortion in a silo. Even as we work hard to change those laws, that we also understand that abortion is connected to issues of maternal mortality, and issues of poverty, and issues of safe neighborhoods, and issues of police abuse of some communities. And it's about housing quality and so on, and that we take a more rounded approach, and even in places where abortion has become almost impossible for people to access, there are reproductive justice advocates and activists on the ground who are saying it's not the end, because there's still so many other things that we can work on, and so many other ways that we can make a positive change. So they're still doing the work, and that's what I'm excited about. I also think that I'm not a lawyer, but I travel in kind of legal circles and do interdisciplinary legal studies scholarship. And so I pay some attention to that side of it. And I think, the big legal groups like the Center for Reproductive Rights are still doing what they do, what they do really well, which is appellate litigation, federal litigation. But I think there's some new public interest groups, like this group called if/when/how, which is doing advocacy work more on the ground and helping to defend people, women, doctors, other pregnant people who are being prosecuted for abortions or for things that the authorities think are abortions. And I think that's really vital. And I think it's important for us not to be too highfalutin, and to think that, that the action always has to be in the federal courts or in the Supreme Court. There is a lot to do much closer to where people are living, because people are having crises of all kinds in this arena, and and people need legal help and support, and they need medical help and support. So I'm very impressed with all of that work, especially the stuff that's happening kind of closer to the ground. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, there also are places where we're expanding rights, and that's made a big difference. People have an opportunity right now. You can support the campaign that's happening in Wisconsin. There's an election to the Wisconsin Supreme Court that will be determinative for abortion rights in that state. So if you have dollars to spare, or if you can participate from wherever you are in a phone bank, that would be something to do. People are working very, very hard on these issues right now.
Just on top of that, are there people you follow? Like, where could we, if I was going like, I want to know where I can put my dollars or my phone banking, what's someone who would be a source of that information?
Well, there's a great online magazine called Rewire, which is a reproductive justice magazine. Oh, good. Somebody put something about Wisconsin in the chat. Thank you so much, David Robeson. Yeah, so Rewire News, Rewire News Group, they have a podcast called Boom! Lawyered, which is kind of a cheeky take on the legal developments. But Rewire itself, it's all about reproductive justice. So it's not just abortion, it's the whole enchilada. Katha Pollitt, the feminist columnist for The Nation magazine, with whom I did a book event last week, she often will put something in her Nation column about a good organization to fund. Who else? Melissa Murray, law professor at NYU Law School. She and two other law professors have a podcast called Strict Scrutiny, which is about the Supreme Court and the culture around it. And they also will often share stuff on Twitter and elsewhere about critical battles that are happening right now. So those are a few things that I try and stay in touch with. Oh, there's another one. There's another podcast called Repros Fight Back, which also tries to kind of cover the whole gamut of reproductive rights and justice issues. It's hosted by one of the good advocacy organizations in Washington.
Great. Kinshasa, do you want to read the chat one? Or do you want me to?
Sure, I can go ahead and read what's there. First question that came in was, what were the strongest systemic variables that drove at the advocates' effectiveness and success? Was it grassroots power, legal theory and arguments, elected officials championing, media and messaging, or just the changing times?
That is a great question. I put a lot of emphasis on the grassroots dimension. I think the spark for change comes from outside of conventional and legal institutions. I think that's usually true. I think certainly in this issue that the spark comes from the outside, the impetus. However, a lot of the story I tell is about the interplay between inside and outside. And I think that that's really important. In fact, when I was writing, I was thinking a lot about that debate that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had maybe in 2008, and the question was, who caused success around civil rights? Was it Lyndon Johnson, or was it Martin Luther King Jr., or maybe even people who were more radical than MLK? And they were both right. I think, it had to be civil rights activists on the outside, and it had to be people on the inside who knew how to pull the levers of power. And I see a similar dynamic here. There's a lot of outside force. And then there's a certain point at which people like this Assemblywoman Constance Cook say, okay, the advocates, they don't know how to win. I know how to win because I know how to count votes, and I know how to work the parliamentary procedures that are necessary in order to move a bill across the finish line. And I really think we need those people, and we need people who know how to lobby them on the inside of the corridors of power. They're vital in order to get formal legal change, which is something I think matters. But of course, we need the energy and the pressure that comes from a variety of different outside groups. So that's kind of the way I balance it out, in the way I see it in the historical sources.
Okay. Moving ahead, we have a comment that came in. Apparently, there's a very compelling biographical piece of data on Florence Kennedy on Wikipedia.
Right. And then a whole bunch of stuff about Wisconsin, and
Good.
A great thing on Dawn Wooten, a nurse who filed whistleblower complaints about sterilization. So there's a lot of good talk happening in the chat.
Oh, so she was the one who filed the complaint about the ICE facility, right? Yeah. I was at a conference that she was being honored at. Yeah.
And now she's on food stamps.
I didn't know that part.
Sorry,
Um,
I'm the one who put that in the chat, and I really want people to support her because she's spoken in Congress, she's spoken all over, and she's suffered continually. 57 women at least were sterilized without their knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that in. If you don't mind, if you know a way to support her with a GoFundMe or something like that. But I
Right,
think
she has a GoFundMe. She
Okay,
has a
good.
live GoFundMe. Her name is Dawn Wooten, and anybody can support her. I did a couple weeks ago.
All right, thanks for that. Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
I think it's important to remember that the sterilization abuse issue did not go away after the people that I'm writing about. I mean, that the policies that they promoted made a big difference. But we have seen, for example, in the California prison system, there were a whole group of women who were sterilized without their consent, and there's now a reparations program in the state of California that has acknowledged this. And this is, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And there also was this scandal in an ICE detention facility where a group of women were given hysterectomies that they did not choose to have.
So we are almost out of time, but I'm going to just throw in oh, good. We have a provocative question from Catherine. Go for it.
I'm listening to you guys talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I am one of the outer boroughs, Queens. And what I have heard tonight, and Felicia, this is not meant as a criticism. This is just me thinking out loud. It's Manhattan, Manhattan, Manhattan. And you acknowledge that, right? And part of what I'm hearing and what I've heard at Hunter things before is because we grew up in New York, because of where we went, because of who we are, we tend to look at things through that New York lens. I currently live in the state of Florida. Right? How do we handle a criticism that this is a New York story? This is a New York thing. My state is different. I've lived in Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina. I'm looking to get north of Florida right now. But this sort of, how New York, California, liberal elites. I guess that's my question. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's good. First thing I would say is come to Vermont. Move up. Love to have you. We just put a reproductive liberty amendment in our Constitution. But seriously, I think that a lot of the details are New York details in the book, right? It's so I don't make any excuse for telling that story. I mean, I think the way to tell a story about how this really intimate kind of social and legal change happens is to study it in a very detailed way. So that's what I did. But in terms of the point, that what I see as sort of the political take home, I think that affects us all. I think that wherever we are, it's the same story. And it's not like, just because somebody's in New York that they would like have the luxury of being able to have a wider agenda. I actually think that the wider agenda, the reproductive justice agenda, the agenda that would say we don't just care about abortion rights, we also care about people's ability to have children and to raise those kids in dignity and safety. Like, I think that's an agenda that travels more widely than an agenda that says, what we need is legal abortion alone, right? I think that talking about people's ability, their right to choose to have kids, and making it possible for people to make that choice or those choices, I think that is that's an agenda that can travel very, very widely, and it should. And so what I'm afraid of as somebody who who does advocacy work in this area, is that when times are bad, we kind of batten down the hatches and we say, you know, we have to narrow our agenda. Like we just need to fight for like the one drug that we can still, you know, prescribe to people for medication abortion, or, you know, or just fight for this, you know, 16 weeks to hold on to our 16 weeks or whatever. I know it's scary and there are terrible things that are happening today, but I do think that that forming broad political coalitions and having an expansive agenda, you know, that speaks to everybody's needs. I actually think that that is a political winner wherever we are. You might not agree.
No, I agree with you. I mean, like I said, I've spent as much of my life now in the South as I did in New York. So it's different.
It's left its mark. Hey, this is Mari.
Hi.
Hi. I've been in Chicago since I left Hunter, and it is a different sort of world. But you know, I'm working on an issue that's somewhat related but not related, which is that I work on civil rights for children, getting their IEPs and their 504s and preventing disciplinary consequences for things that are actually rooted in disability. And it ties into the student to prison pipeline, and it also goes all the way back to the lack of resources in raising children. And I think that you're right. I think that in terms of like the middle of the country, the winning argument is about how we protect people's abilities to create and provide for families. Whether it is, you know, a family of cats or puppies, or, you know, a family of children that you've had or that you adopt or that you foster or whatever it is. There's, you know, I do see, I was surprised when I came out to Chicago because I discovered a lot of my classmates were a little defensive around New Yorkers coming in because we thought we were better than them. And we're like, I don't know what you're talking about. We are just like normal and you guys have to catch up. So we do have that like New York snottiness to us sometimes. But you know, from a personal perspective, you're absolutely right about location. I am dealing with some treatments for a form of leukemia that has suddenly cropped up. I have a hospital 6 miles away on country roads and 2 stoplights that can do everything I need it to do, which is pretty remarkable. And in college, I had an ovarian cyst removed on an emergency basis by a doctor at the University of Chicago. And, you know, I was very cavalier. I've got 2 ovaries, just lop the thing off. And he goes, no, you may need it. And he did reconstructive surgery. You know, I was the beneficiary of this much more progressive thinking that you silly 19-year-old girl, you don't know whether you need your ovaries in the future, but let's keep your options open. And that that's a remarkable gift, right? And everybody should be subject to this level of treatment, this level of let's figure out how to get your suffering through. Let's try to prevent you needing to drive. You know, I could go to the University of Chicago. At this moment, it's a 100-mile round trip for me, as opposed to a 12-mile, you know, drive for me at a local facility. But there are people in Chicago who've got to drive quite a ways because of these medical deserts. But Felicia, I really enjoyed your storytelling. I really found it very engaging, and I particularly loved the realization of, oh, my mom actually did something important that I was completely unaware of. That was absolutely beautifully expressed, and I think instructive to the rest of us.
Yeah, thanks. My hope is that even if people aren't persuaded by what I have to say about reproductive rights and justice, that maybe they'll be persuaded that they should go talk to their mom when they have the chance, or research their mom if their mom's not still around.
I want to let everyone know that we're past our time. It's been a wonderful discussion and really great to hear you two in dialogue. It's been a very moving and powerful discussion again. So we'll conclude here.
Yeah, buy the book, everybody.
Buy the book.
You can buy the book. I speak to reading groups. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Allison. Yay, Allison Pugh.
Pleasure.
And
Thank
thank
you
you,
for writing
Kinshasa.
it, Felicia.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.